But anytime I wear socks in the house, I slide everywhere and I can't get traction when I walk. Yeah, we have those for like the jump. Nice. Well, hello, we're going to get started. So, hi, Mom and Ray and Savannah. Hello. They're in Georgia. They're in Savannah. They're gone. So they're watching on the YouTube. I think it's pretty cool. So tonight we are looking at session 3. I call this Birth of a Nation. So this is the one where we're going to look at proposed crossing sites, show you a few pictures. I was doing a bit of research here earlier in the day, and there is so much additional information that's come out in the last decade since I put all this. It's not new information, it's better footage. There was only one source of footage, really one source of footage 10, 12 years ago when I started this, and that was Jim and Penny Caldwell and Leonard Moeller. Remind me to get you books. I have books for you all tonight. They're all upstairs. Maybe I can have Stephanie fetch them. But ever since that time, people have gotten in, and really it's been 2016 and beyond. People are now in with 4K drone footage and all kinds of stuff. So I'm pretty jealous, but I have used some of it for tonight. And maybe someday I can get a 4K drone into Saudi Arabia, get some of my own footage. So, so tonight we're going to be covering Exodus 13, and this is the Exodus out of Egypt and the stories that are in behind that. One second. Yeah, it's really. I don't multitask very well. That's my problem. So tonight we're going to look at Exodus chapter 13. We're going to read through this. This is the route out of Egypt. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, let me show you some numbers. Maybe people like timelines and numbers, but this is really just, again, thinking through what this actually would have been like from a human perspective. Is it even feasible? There's all kinds of objections from a particular perspective about, the Exodus couldn't have happened, archaeologically, but even humanly. So we'll look at a few of those tonight. But we're going to start with Exodus chapter 13. I'll just read this, and then if someone else wants to jump in, although I don't have a shotgun mic tonight for the live stream. So would someone be really offended if I read the whole time? Yeah. Okay. I try to engage people, but we're engaged. We're sitting in the very back, hiding on the stairs. We're engaged. Got your notepad out. 5 chair deep. Okay, so this is Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through 19. Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the route to the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, or the Yam Suf, which is the Sea of... Oh my gosh, nobody was paying attention. Paying attention to the opposite. The Sea of Termination. It's not the Sea of Reeds. Sea of Reeds is incorrect. That is incorrect. You never ask a question unless you're reasonably certain that somebody knows the answer. So that was on me. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Sea of Termination. And you can see, just as a reminder from this point here, it's around the wilderness by way of this massive body of water. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So we need to talk a little bit before we go on, because this is a really important, point. This New King James Version in verse 18, the second half of it, the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Does somebody have a different translation, like an ESV or an NIV? Or can you read verse 18 of Exodus 13? Whoever's out. That'd be very different. That won't work. 13:18. Let me see what Peterson has to say in the Message.
So God led the people on the wilderness road, looping around to the Red Sea. The Israelites left Egypt in military formation.
Okay, military formation.
God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went out of Egypt armed for battle.
Armed for battle.
Instead, he led them in a roundabout way through the desert towards the Red Sea. The Israelites were armed for battle.
Armed for battle. So that little word there, armed for battle, or in orderly ranks, or what was Peterson's?
He's military formation.
Military formation. So this word, I think, is an important word, and it's the word shemush. And it means manly and obstinate in war. Like, if you get in a fight and then your dad comes and helps you, and now you're a little kid, you're standing behind your dad and you're all strong and you're like, my dad can beat up your dad kind of a thing. I mean, it's this sort of, I am thinking I'm big and strong and proud, and typically that gets translated to martial array or orderly ranks, because why do the Chinese line up hundreds of thousands of people and precisely time everything? Why has the military done that always? To put fear into the hearts of people, right? Look at how strong and proud and fierce these people are, right? So these orderly ranks are an indication that Israel is coming out very proud and organized. Okay, this is interesting to me. Do you think that the Hebrews, when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh's hand, that they had much military training? Down he goes. We're good? Back up. Do you think they had much military training? No, they're slaves, right? Why did they get put in slavery in the first place? Keep them from rising up militarily and taking over Egypt. So there's a vested interest. We know for sure they were not getting trained by Pharaoh's army. So they probably didn't have weapons. There was no Second Amendment in Egypt. In America, we have that. That's where we can have handguns. Everyone has handguns in America. But, so what is this really saying? They weren't a trained military. They didn't have weapons. They were armed for battle. And I think it's interesting here, they're armed for battle, but right before that, God says, hey, I'm going to take you out, and when you go out of Egypt, you're going to want to go on the main road straight to the land of Philistia, or straight to Canaan, to the land of the Philistines. You're going to want to go that way, but I'm going to tell you not to go that way because you don't have the stomach for battle yet. You don't really know what it means to fight. So you put those two things together, and I think it's very interesting that they came out of Egypt. They just watched God deconstruct the entire system. They watched God take out every single one, 10 of these gods, all the way up to Pharaoh himself. They had to have been feeling like their God was absolutely indestructible. And he was. And that they were indestructible because they were following him. Like, think about what it's going to be like when the breakthrough happens and it's all just there, right? But God says something very important here. And he says, I know that you just, essentially, this is my interpretation here. I know that you just watched me destroy all of Egypt, and you think you can take anyone now, but I'm not going to lead you right into the battle because you're not yet ready for it. You don't have the stomach for battle. And you're coming out of Egypt, manly and obstinate in war, but you're not ready yet for a fight. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
God is saying, you are going to have the fight of your lives, kicking out the giants from the land. But right now, when I set you free, you're not ready. So I'm going to do something else with you to prepare you. Do you see that? Everything that we're going to look at tonight needs to be seen in that light. Why God does what he does, the decisions that get made, what ends up transpiring over the next chapter is all interpreted in the light of this, that God knew they didn't have the stomach for battle, and so he needed to train them for battle. So the next one here. And I love that Joseph, had a promise. He made people promise to take him out of Egypt because he knew it was going to happen. That was a little bit about the parashah for the week about remembrance. He didn't just recall it. They were prepared to rehearse this and get him out of Egypt when it was time. So Exodus 13:20 through 22. So they, the Hebrews, took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. So it was a 24-hour journey. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. We'll look at where Succoth is. Succoth is on the delta right about where today's border of the Suez Canal is. We'll see that when we get to the maps. So Exodus 14. Now, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite of Baal Zemphan. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are bewildered. They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all of his army, so that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." And they did so. All right, we're going to stick on this for a little bit tonight, and this is a linchpin of our geographic analysis of the route out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, the Sea of Termination. This is a critical 4 verses. So we just saw at the end of 13 that they camped at the edge of the wilderness. So they'd wandered through the wilderness and they were on the edge. Either they'd wandered through it or they'd wandered out the very edge of the. Other interpretations say they turn around right there and camp before Pi-hahiroth. Now, if I think I shared this the first week, Josephus writes that Moses was a great general and he was known for his exploits in the Sinai Peninsula. He didn't call it the Sinai Peninsula, but that's what he was talking about. And so we work from that assumption. Moses knows the territory very well. He's leading them to the land of Midian, which he lived in for 40 years. He's leading them out of Egypt, which he lived in for 40 years. He's leading them through the Sinai Peninsula, which he was a general in, fighting the Hittites and other people. So we're quite sure that Moses knows the way out of this place. But it's then that God says, stop and turn. Do something different. You're almost out of Egypt, but before you get out, I want you to turn and go another route. Why? So that Pharaoh will look at them and he'll say, and this is another one of those little data points. Some people say that Egypt's boundary was at the Suez Canal, not all the way to today's boundary with Egypt and Israel through the Sinai Peninsula. But this is a good example of how Pharaoh obviously had spies all the way throughout the Sinai Peninsula, because he was able to get information that the Hebrews were wandering. So they either had people tracking them or they had networks of information that were relaying this stuff back to Memphis, 200 miles away from where this was happening. But look at verse 3. Pharaoh will say, the Lord's setting a trap for Pharaoh so he can get glory, so that the Egyptians will know. But it says that they are bewildered by the land. So if you get bewildered by the land, oftentimes that would happen in a territory that isn't flat. Anybody ever been out in a wide open space, walking through a salt flat or whatever? Well, it's not that hard to get lost if you know the direction of the stars or the sun, or the direction that you came. But anyone have been in like the Canyonlands in Utah, or in a tall, narrow spot where there's you can't see where lots of directions are? It's much more difficult to get bewildered and lost when you're in valleys than when you're on mountain peaks. So they'll get bewildered, and the wilderness has closed them in. This gives us an indication that the wilderness has got some kind of a geographic thing that they get boxed into this region. So they're out there, they turn, and then they get lost, and then they get trapped. They get trapped inside of the wilderness that closed them in. Well, what sort of geography would close somebody in? And would they be on the hills? On the mountains? No, they'd be down in the valleys. They're called wadis in that part of the world. Down. So there's a geographic thing that happens here. They turn, they go another route, they get lost in the wilderness, and new geological features emerge that trap them. And it's such a degree that Pharaoh knows that they're trapped, and he decides to go and get them. You see that? So we'll look at that. Yes, question.
Is it right to do questions?
Oh yeah, please.
Okay, so I've missed a beat here somewhere. I'm confused because last week you spoke about Pharaoh was the firstborn. So that's where I misunderstood. So how come Pharaoh is chasing them, which we know from scriptures Pharaoh chases them? But I understood last week, didn't he die?
No, that was the big revelation, that Pharaoh is awake at midnight. And he was supposed to be the firstborn, but he was awake, and so he didn't die. The scriptures say he didn't die. This says he didn't die. So the scandal is that he wasn't the firstborn. That's the big punchline. Yeah. That he's an illegitimate ruler. He holds on to his power. The big scary demon that you think is in control of your life, when he actually gets exposed, you realize, just like Isaiah says about Lucifer or whoever this, Isaiah 14, is this the one that terrified the nations? Is this the one when we see him for, as he is? Right, so this is how God deals with the illegitimate ruler. Okay, there's an illegitimate king in Egypt now, and God's drawn him out into a trap. But it would have been nice if he had told the people, because it probably freaked the people out. Moving their families all the way across the world and getting stuck in a place right before you enter the promised land.
Can I ask a question? So he led them into the wilderness by means of a cloud or fire, and they still doubted, being bewildered. Do you think at that point maybe his cloud was invisible, or?
I think that this we'll see in just a minute that the cloud is with them all the way up into the crossing site. So the cloud, I'm sure, fire and cloud turns and they're going another direction. Nobody knows the way out of Egypt. They've not been ever out of there. The only person who we can assume knows the way out is Moses, the one that God is saying, don't do this. I know you can see how to get out. Don't go. I have another plan. Go this way. Go this way. So Moses goes that way. The cloud and the fire goes that way. And all the people just go, oh, okay, and go with him. That's my assumption. They don't know. They're following their leader. But some bad things begin to happen. So this is... Oh, well, they decided to do all of them. Exodus 14:5. It was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? We've seen this 9 other times. So he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. He also took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. So he takes his entire military force out of Egypt, which is a bad tactical move when all of your government and ruling class has been destroyed, when all of your economic engines from livestock and cattle, they're basically being destroyed, and everyone that's left to protect goes out far out past their homeland. This was a strategic nightmare.
To fight a battle with people that weren't warriors or
Yeah.
brave enough.
Right.
So is he trying to kind of put himself back on the throne, so to speak, after being disgraced and being called out as this illegitimate dude?
I think that's probably right. Put himself back on the throne, you know, show his own
But
power.
People weren't afraid of him, were they, then, if they?
But they still follow him.
Yeah.
I go in his sermons. He's still leading the people.
Yeah. Well, I imagine those are the people that, you know, you still possess in your leadership, you still possess the fear of. It's not like the moment you get exposed as a fraud, everybody won't follow you. I mean, I think that
Remember, this was also not a democracy.
yeah, right.
So the people didn't have the wherewithal to just rise up against the leadership.
Right. Yeah, it's the beginning of an unraveling. It's not an instantaneous one, probably. So God draws out the entire fighting force and all the chariots. And the chariots were the mobile seats of power. I mean, these weapons of war, there was nothing like them in the ancient era. And it also tells us something. Can you ride a chariot on a mountain? No, you can't. There's only one place you can ride a chariot. You can't ride it on a beach. That's very hard. You can't ride it through the mud. You can't ride it in the hills. You can ride it in a plane. So the fact that he took 600 chariots gives us a clue on where they're going and what kind of topography they're going to be covering. They're going to be riding through a plain or somewhere that has a hard level surface for the most part. So he pursued, this is verse 8, hardened or strengthened. Talked about that briefly at the end. The heart of Pharaoh was strengthened. He wrestled with God. He worked out this battle with God, and what was in his heart got harder, got stronger, which was here, rage, contempt towards God. And he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So they're still feeling pretty good. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses, all the chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and they overtook them, camping by the sea. 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? That's a pretty cheeky statement. Why have you so dealt with us to bring us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. This is what I think the Lord was talking about when they rolled out of Egypt, manly and obstinate for war. He said, this is not a fighting crew yet. This is not a crew that can go straight to the land of the Philistines and fight. Because at the first sign of trouble, this is what comes out. We're all going to die. I rather would have lived in slavery than die out here. Let us go back to our meat pots a little bit later. So we'll move on. 14. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see them again. You will see them no more forever. For the Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? So Moses says to the people, why are you crying out? Stand still and see the salvation of God. And then God says, why are you crying out? It's an interesting, is this rhetorical? Is this just for literary flourish? I wonder if it isn't that God really does expect us to believe him of what he said he was going to do. It gets crazy. There's a kind of cry to him where he's like, you don't need to cry out for me for this. You need to move ahead. Like there's some sort of an expectation that we would believe what he said. I don't think God is a genuine question, right? What's in your heart that you're crying out to me right now? What is it that you don't believe or that you're worried about? A lot of times, I have a friend who taught me this, and I think it's really good. He said that emotions come and go with the passage of time as long as we don't attach danger to them. We just have emotions. They come and go. We don't have to have a theory about what emotions are, but it's the attachment of danger to the emotion that gets it stuck somewhere. So I'm feeling angry. Oh, I'm feeling angry. And then it comes and goes. I'm feeling angry and I'm always going to be angry. Or I'm angry because you've done this and I can't get you to stop. And it's always going to be like this. Whatever, the next little thought that attaches danger to the situation is what begins to have what we would consider toxic emotional responses. And I wonder if there isn't something like this with the Lord of what is the catastrophizing or the danger attachment in the minds of the children or in the minds of us. When God says, go and do this, and we go and do it, and it doesn't just all come together exactly how we expected. What's the danger attachment that we're putting on it? Is there one? Is there an expectation of the Lord to say, why are you crying out to me? Which isn't shame on you, it's stop, think about why you're crying out to me. Think about that. I don't want to say too much more about that because my wife will use it against me because I don't practice what I preach.
Well, I was actually going to say, I wonder if danger is just another word for agreement.
Huh.
What if we attach an agreement to it? I'm angry, and now I'm bitter, and I don't believe God, or I don't trust this person, or that's what it makes me think of.
Interesting.
And then it takes root.
Right.
But here, it brings you back to my point. They can still see the fire pillar and they can still see the cloud.
Yeah.
And yet they still doubt. Like they still think, I wish I had fire pillar and a cloud. That's just yes. We talked about that. So there's no doubt that they must have known in about the routine what the citizens look like.
Yeah. Well, they knew.
I would also, if I was God, be like, I'm right here. I can be crying out to me,
Yeah, I mean, it's like he's, I don't know. I mean, the parallels are apropos. It's like he's just giving them little bits every month or two so that everybody has just what they need. He's continuing to display himself. It isn't the overwhelming victory that was promised, but God is continually saying, look, I'm here with you. Here, it's like this. They're seeing a cloud and fire and they're thinking, well, what does cloud and fire do? Right? They see God with them, but they don't see God with them defeating the enemy. How many times do we see God with us, but God's with us isn't doing the thing we want him to be doing, so we're like, God's not with us. Right?
Isn't there an element of what you talked about last week of all these different gods? So these dudes, they're going to have lived under Egypt's rule, and they're going to have experienced Egypt's gods. And Egypt's gods don't do anything. They have no power. So their understanding of God and power is yet to be recognized in them, in their humanity, because they've seen all of these plagues, but they've still got this mentality that it takes longer than one thing to get them out, even as spectacular as that thing is. It's still through their culture of a lot of years to have that generation upon generation upon generation of captivity taken
Right.
out of it.
Yeah. And I think it's Bill Johnson that says that the miraculous things of God are not one-time events, they're revelations of his character. They're revelations of his nature, right? And they're discovering this. It's not just that they saw God do something awesome. They're discovering the I am, not the I do alone. And that takes a long time. And I think that this is such a journey. This is such a story. This whole Exodus story is the story of faith in God. Salvation from sin, liberation, sanctification, all your big fancy sanctification words, and this is the story, So God says to Moses in verse 15, why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Keep working. Keep moving ahead. Go forward. Except there's a giant lake in the way, or sea. But don't just go forward. Forward with a new strategy that you get from me. And it's not a very rational strategy. This is the strategy. Lift up your rod. What's the rod? Authority. It says authority. Lift it up. Use it now. Okay? Use your authority over the obstacle. Stretch it out over the sea and divide it. Doesn't say stretch it out over the sea and ask me to divide it. Maybe that's a semantical thing there, but when you're moving in authority, when God says use your authority, stretch your hand, go to work and move the obstacles. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can quietly think to yourself, be removed and cast into the sea. No, what do you have to do? You have to reach out your hand. You have to use the authority. You have to speak. And it's divided. And then the outcome of that, the children of Israel will go on dry ground in the midst of the sea, the obstacle. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I gain honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. This is how the world knows that God is God. When they see him getting honor, elevating his children, and putting down his enemies. Now, I think that we can go pretty crazy here with that by calling a lot of people our enemies. But there's something to God is not calling us against people. We know our enemy is a spiritual one, but I think it's important that we know, if you don't already, that one of the ways that God is seen as glorious to the world is the victory of his children and the defeat of the enemy. That gets God glory. And he likes it. And God went before the camp, verse 19, Exodus 14. And the angel before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. So it was in front and it moved. So the angel that led them out is now their rear guard, Isaiah. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. So what's now protecting the Egyptians and the Israelites? A manifestation of God's power and presence, an angelic presence of God protecting them. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other. So Egypt was in darkness, and Israel was in the light. Again, this is plague 9. This is good to be in Goshen. This is God giving light. That God's activity to save his children gives light to the children, and it feels like darkness. Children.
In 19, when it says the angel of God, is that a reference to Jesus, or is it another angel?
I don't know. We don't get a lot of information about that. And I've actually never looking up what that actual word is, the angel, the Malach Elohim, a messenger.
If Jesus is God, it doesn't make sense. What the angel would be God.
Yeah, I don't know. It fits a type and shadow thing here, as although it's not the deliverer, it's the barrier between, I've never, in looking at the incarnations of Jesus, or the pre-incarnation of Jesus in the Old Testament, I've never looked at that, which doesn't mean it's not. Just interesting. So it came between, this is verse 21, Exodus 14. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So this was an overnight scenario. Not only did they go through the sea, but they went through the sea at night with a pillar of fire, which I think would have been pretty cool. You wouldn't see all the scary creatures in the water swimming next to you. If it was
Any graphics to that?
maybe you'd have lightning inside of the water or something. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now, here it doesn't say Pharaoh went in. That's a piece of detail that we get from the psalmist, that Pharaoh and his chariots drowned. But here it just says Pharaoh and his chariots. Maybe it's presumed, I'm not sure. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. That's an understatement. But I find it interesting that the Bible specifically talks about chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea. Specifically. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." But it's too late at that point. Then the Lord said to Moses, it didn't just happen. God said, "Kill all these people," which is kind of a hard statement. I guess it's no worse than Canaan. But we should make a movie and try and course correct for what was actually going on in those areas. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hands over the sea that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and to their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hands of the Egyptians. So it took one night. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt, and the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So how did the people die? Probably not. Has anyone ever been scuba diving? Haven't gone down under like 50 feet? Huh?
It's like 26.
26 meters. The pounds per square inch of pressure, or pounds per square whatever meter pressure, they're walking through an area of water that was roughly around 1,500, 2,000 feet deep. And when the water collapses on them, they find themselves, 1,500 feet, 1,500, 2,000 feet. We'll look at that.
That's a five.
500. That's 300 meters. 500 and a cubic meter. Just for those people, a cubic meter weighs a ton. Yeah.
Whoa. A cubic.
So that's 300 tons.
300 tons of water comes crashing back down on top of them.
So they're squished.
They're squished. They're absolutely obliterated. And it's not like the pressure all of a sudden, but like you got to be thinking about the scale of this. They didn't die from lack of oxygen. They died from having their rib cages crushed. But then they see the bodies on the seashore, which is kind of gross. And it would have happened a little bit later once the bodies filled with air and got bloated and floated up to the top. The remains of these people floated up to the top. And they saw them. And so do you think they saw them on the Egyptian side or on the free side? Probably on the free side. It took them 12 hours to walk across this sea. They wouldn't be able to see. So if they, I mean, you can only see a couple hundred meters, I guess, into the ocean. So they see the dead bodies on the liberated side, which I think is an important piece for a little bit later. Does anyone have any questions about this? We'll move on from the scripture piece. We did a lot of scripture here, but it's an important week for scripture. We can move on. Any questions? We can go to some history. So here's my wonderful animation. These are the Jews. Look at, oh, we're going out of Egypt. Yay. Oh, what's going on here? We get stuck. Oh, here comes Pharaoh. Dun, dun, dun. This is an 18th dynasty chariot found in King Tut's tomb. So this is what they would have been driving. Okay? It's an actual chariot from the 1500 BC. And this isn't how they actually drove, but run away, run away, run away. So they captured them. And we'll go and we'll take a look at this area here. So I wanted to look just a little bit and just give you a few little bits of numbers so that we understand the scale of this. Because part of this is humanizing this story from the flannel graph Jesus and Disney's versions of things, so that we've got some kind of a sense of the scale. So in Numbers chapter 2, they do a census of all of the children of Israel that came out of Egypt. And hopefully I don't have to, I did. I just updated this, but I have to swipe every one. Okay. So these are in the census in Numbers chapter 2. These are the fighting age men that are in Israel after the Exodus. This is about, I don't know, it could be 6 months, maybe a year. So these are the 12 tribes of Israel, 2 years after the Exodus. These are fighting age men only. It's 20. It's 20 being a man, 20 for entering military service, 32 for being a high priest. Those were the of age. Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and with men. The stature word is about the 3 tiers of ages in Israel, being of appropriate age. So these were 20-year-old men in Egypt, or after the Exodus. So there was no time for them to give birth to new men to grow up to 20. So these were the people that came out of Egypt. Okay? So our total number here is 603,550 soldiers. Men between the ages of 20 and 60. Now, there's some discussion about these whole numbers and why they're this way, and it goes crazy. But let's just assume for a moment that the Bible is talking about actual numbers instead of metaphor. So we know that there are 603,550 soldiers. So we can roughly imagine that if you're 20 and you're a man, you have a wife. And we can also roughly assume that there are more women than men in Israel, right? Why would that be? Men were systematically exterminated this generation. So it's a little bit like in Summit County. I probably shouldn't. Well, it's whatever. Filter went off, but I ignored it. In Summit County in Colorado, where Vail and Aspen is, like the dream for the guys when I was growing up there was to go up to Vail and get a job as a ski bum, working a lift and just snowboard all day, you know? And the story was that all the women knew that there was a bunch of guys up in the hill country. And I had a professional snowboarder friend who was up there all the time. And I I asked her about this, and she's like, yeah, there's way more guys in Summit County, and the girls all know the odds are good, but the goods are odd.
Nice.
That was a little bit of a buildup for not a whole lot of payoff. So, oh, the things are funny in your head. So these are soldiers and women who are older than 20 years. We can make the assumption here using some basic population analysis that there are roughly half of those people will be, half that population for the median age for younger will be 20 years or younger. So we're adding another 321,000, that 50% of the 20-year-old plus, there's also 300,000 people that are 20 years and younger. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then we also, this soldiers and women is 20 to 60. So we can also use, and I can source you on my numbers here, but using baseline population statistics for this time, the people that would have been 60 years and older, based on this number here of 1.2 million men and women ages 20 would be another 241,000. Okay? So we put all this together and we get at 1.7 and some change million people that came out of Egypt. But wait, there's more. Regular price, but tonight on the infomercial. So there's also the Levitical priests, the Levite men that get counted. And the Levites aren't in military service. So there's a separate census for the Levites. And the scriptures count the Levite men as 22,300. Now, the Levite men were not Catholic priests, so they all had wives. So we can assume we're adding then now another 22,000 for the Levites. So now we've got 1.8 million Hebrews coming out of Egypt. But wait, there's more. What's that, Jono? With the Levites, what? Yeah, we didn't add children into that. They were just married priests. You don't want to ruin that life with children. Exodus 12:38 says that a mixed multitude, put in an estimate here about 10%. An additional 10% of the Hebrews. Again, this is conjecture, but it gets us, let's say there's another 181,000 people that leave that are Egyptians. That's percentage-wise of the people, not percentage-wise of Egypt, which had a lot more people. So this is how we get to our number of 1.9, roughly 2 million people. This is how you get to the math about the scale of the population that left out of Egypt. Most certainly, there could be variations in this, huge variations. But the point of doing this is to start with the biblical analysis of 603,000 soldiers and 22,000 Levitical priests and do some very conservative estimations on what that meant for actual population, not including children, not including other stuff. So when you hear the Exodus was, some people say it happened, but there's a couple thousand happened or a couple 100,000. It was a large scale event. And we know from working on backlogs that change logs that what you do for 1,000 people won't work for 1 million subscribers, right? You have to build a different system if you're going to have this kind of a thing. So we also need to think about the geography, not in terms of 1,000 people wandering through, but what kind of an area will support 2 million people plus livestock, plus animals, plus children. This is a massive event. So Puerto Rico, I'm not sure that's there all alone. Oh, this one's self-animated. Well, I updated this. I didn't change this is according to the 2018 CIA World Factbook. And this is population growth rate of nations. Okay, and the question is then, well, if Israel came to Egypt, the Hebrews came into Egypt as 70 people. How many years later did they leave as 1.9 million? Is that even possible? Is that even humanly possible? Rabbits can do it, but can humans? So we're going to answer that question. Here are growth population rates. Japan, minus 0.25%. You need a population growth rate of 1 to sustain your population. So anything less than 1 and your population is shrinking every year. Japan, 0.24, which is no bueno. I don't know how do you say no bueno in Japanese? Anyone know?
No.
What was
I know
it?
Chinese,
I say Chinese, they won't know the difference.
It's true.
Russia, 0.1. That's actually grown. The UK, still diminishing. Canada, a little better. US, a little better. We don't get until, I mean, there's a bunch, but Iran is growing. Israel is growing 1.5. Gaza Strip, 2.25. Egypt, 2 and 3. Uganda, Niger, Angola. So you look at those with explosive population growth. You get up into the 2s and 3s, you're talking about an explosive population growth, which is interesting. All of the explosive populations are happening in the Islamic world. Syria was actually 7.1% population growth for 2018. But that has to do with the civil war, with everyone leaving and then returning. So I didn't include that because it would have blown up the graph. So the Hebrews in Egypt were 3% or a 0.3 exponential growth rate. So it's perfectly feasible that they could have grown. We've got modern populations that are growing at that rate. Now the question is exponential growth curve. It's one thing to do that over the course of 5 years. It's another thing to do it consistently over 100 years. If you're going to have an exponential population growth explosion, then you need a period of time where you're living in the land really, really rich, living in the best part of the land for a long period of time, up near the upper caste of the land. Does that make sense? This is why we talked about that, about Egypt, with the timeline. How long was Israel in Egypt before they were oppressed? Well, maybe it's been 100, 150 years probably. Living good. 70 of those were with Joseph, 40 of those after Joseph, and then they got oppressed. So they've got at least 100 years where they can grow.
And also, didn't Pharaoh say to them, these people are becoming too numerous?
Exactly.
Is why he wanted to oppress them.
Exactly. And so we'll look at the exponential population growth curve and it'll match up. If you like numbers, this is fun. I get excited by this. So the rule of 70, this is an exponential population growth curve over time. So this is a growth curve of 2, not 3, but 2. Exponential population over a constant time. And what that says is that the rule of 70, I'm sorry, I should have just waited for my notes. A 1% growth rate doubles your pop every 70, 2% every 35, 3% doubles it every 17.5 years. So we'll look at the time. 260 years, the Israelites were in Egypt. A 3% growth rate, which is we take the years of growth rate, so it's a 14.5. And we start with 70, and can we work the math? If we start with 70 over 260 years in Egypt, can we get to the numbers that support the counting in Egypt? Do you guys see what I'm doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So it should roughly double 15 times over 260 years in Egypt. So we're going to start here with our 70, and here's our generational curve. So at the end of the 15th generation, we don't quite make it there in our time frames. We got over 2 million people. So let's put some times to this. This is timelines coming back. Now we can put our timeline. So the population, we don't actually get the very 2.2 million. We don't get to 1461. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Scratch that. But this is when Joseph died. again to our timeline. So think about what Joseph got to see. His family came in at 70 and he died, and he had 1,000 people in his little tribe that he was taking care of and protecting inside of Egypt. He got to live to see that. When was Moses born? It should correlate in some senses to a very scary thing for Pharaoh. Moses was born 1526. Look at our generational population explosion. The death of Joseph, each one of those, take 2 of those, and that's a 40-year period. So you see now when you get up to generation 9 and 10, it's taken, like 40, 100 years, 120 years to go from 70 to 10,000. And it takes 40 years to go from 9,000 to 35,000, and then to 71, and then to 143. So they are at the critical population explosion when Moses is born. They're at this exponential growth curve that now there's only 4 generations after the birth of Moses to go from 71,000 to 2 million.
Genesis 1, there weren't 70 people in Egypt because Abraham didn't come on the scene until
Generation, that's not Genesis.
That would make much more better sense. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, generations.
I'm having a hard time figuring it out. Golly.
So this is what Exodus 1:7, the sons of Israel were fruitful, increased greatly, became exceedingly mighty, so the land was filled with them. New king arose over Egypt. He said, the sons of Israel are more numerous and mightier than we. Round about this time. And they're moving from, I was looking at the wrong numbers. I was looking at the between 143,000 to 286,000. The population has just exploded. So this fits the timeline, which I think is pretty interesting. Somewhere around in here, prior to the generations, that arrow's in the wrong spot. So this is why timelines come back to pay off, if you like that sort of thing. So let's just think about this. 1.9 million people. This is me just kind of being nerdy, thinking through. But it's 2 feet in front of you and 2 feet behind you, right? That's not a lot of personal space. We're trying to figure out what kind of procession this is, of people walking. So if you've got 6 cubic feet of space per person, you've got a 2,200-mile long line. That's roughly from San Antonio, where I did all this, all the way up into Canada.
Wow.
So this is a massive line of people. So why am I thinking about single file lines? Well, the topography, they've got to be in a place that supports a mass exodus of 2 million people. Anyone ever been to a Reinhard Bonnke conference or one of those big, massive African million people things? And I can't imagine, but they're always in big, wide open spaces. So you don't have the congestion issues. You know this. So one last piece here. If there was 2 million people, and let's say they were 25 people wide with 6 cubic feet of space per person, that's a 45-mile long procession. Now, why 25 people wide? Well, 25 people wide times 6 is what, 300? No. 6 cubic feet of space per person? No. 150. The size of the valleys that they're walking through are pretty narrow. They get down to a size like that. So it's about the smallest point of the line because it would stretch out. Well, why are we talking about that? Well, just ultimately here, that would stretch from Nuevo, which is the crossing site, down to Sharm el-Sheikh. 45-mile long would go from there all the way down and then back up halfway up the Sinai Peninsula. If they're standing in a narrow, what I'm showing you here, and you've definitely got more space than, 150 feet, but this is a massive group of people, and they cannot be wandering for 40 years in a mountainous region. There's no way. It's not feasibly possible. This is the topography, detailed topography. The traditional Mount Sinai is somewhere up in this area. So there's no possible way that this location for the mountain, for the wandering, for the scale, size, and scope of this actually fits. This is just another data point. The conclusion, of course, up until this point has been, well, the Exodus didn't happen because the mountain doesn't support it. But we know better than that. So I just want to show you a couple of pictures here now. This site, Nuevo, we're going to take you in on Google Earth, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute here. But I want to show you some of these photos first. Here at this site, there are coral, very interesting coral features. And you can see the photo on the left of the coral. It's kind of grainy. These are all in the books that I'm going to give to y'all tonight. And you can take them home and have them and look at all of this. This comes out of Leonard Muller's book. But you can see on the right, you know, a little sketch over what they think that that would be. And there's piles of these coral elements. I have a little video to show you of that. Here's another piece of coral. And it's interesting because this is a very sandy seabed. And then there's just random bits of coral poking up out of a flat seabed. It's not like down at the Straits of Tiran where there's these huge coral formations. Coral is an organic matter, and it grows on other organic matter that it can feed on. So they grow on rocks that have life that, you know, they can eventually eat. The idea here is that wooden chariots ended up at the bottom of the Red Sea, and coral attached to the organic matter of these chariots, and then took the shape of the organic matter of the chariots, and then calcified, got hard, and died, and remains at the bottom of the seafloor. Here's a picture. I think this guy's name is Aaron Sear, and you can see this better with a high-res photo. I just took a picture of the thing in my book. But he went down there and he wrote it that are connected into all of these different pieces of coral. So I'm going to show you a little overview, and then we'll transition to Google Earth. This is an example of some of the most recent high-res footage that people have put together around the site. It's the Saudi Arabian side.